So welcome everyone to poetryEast. Yeah, really good to have you tune in to poetryEast. Normally poetryEast is held very often here at the London Buddhist Centre, in the main shrine room of the London Buddhist Centre in Bethnal Green in London. But of course, since this pandemic, we've been doing all our events online. One of the great things about that for me, and it seems a bit, I don't know, a bit strange to be talking about great things in the middle of a pandemic, but it's given me the opportunity and it's given me the provocation to reach out to poets and writers and artists, especially in the US, that I'm very inspired by. And right at the top of my list is Dana Gioia, going to be our guest today. Dana's work I came upon by happenstance. I listened to a few of his readings online. I don't know even quite how I happened upon them. Strangely, Dana hasn't got a publisher in the UK, which I still find a bit of a mystery. But I went to New York for my one and only visit to New York, and I was in Strand Bookshop, which is for me kind of bookshop heaven, and I was already in America, which for me was very exciting, and being in New York was, very like curiously exciting. I expected to be rather disdainful, I'm afraid, of New York, but I loved it immediately. Anyway, I was in Strand's bookshop, and I happened upon this book, which you can see has got all these markers in it because there's so many things I've wanted to reference. I happened on this book called Can Poetry Matter? And even sitting in the bookshop there, just flicking through the title essay, I discovered a writer, a critic, a poet, whose thought strangely, almost spookily matched my own. Questions that I had been asking myself, as it were, under my breath, Dana Gioia was asking very cogently out loud. For me, it was something of a minor revelation. It's as if the book came to me at a particular moment. I came to poetry myself late. I wasn't publishing poetry until my 50s. I'd been reading poetry only then since my 30s. And after reading Keats and Shelley and Dante and so on, the idea of ever writing a poem seemed absurd and embarrassing. But by the time I was in my 50s, I came to start writing. But I had all these questions as I came into the world of poetry, a little bit into the world of poetry. And it was only meeting this book, Can Poetry Matter? And then exploring so many of Dana's books, Poetry as Enchantment, The Catholic Writer Today, Disappearing Ink. Essay on essay, I find myself enthralled and in curious amount of agreement. So I'm really delighted to welcome Dana Gioia to poetryEast. So come and join us. Really good to see you, Dana. Yeah, so I'd like to sort of pitch in with this first question, and it's a sort of an unusual question. But I wanted to, you've written all these wonderful critical essays on poetry. You're also a very fine poet, and we'll be exploring that in our second conversation and hearing you read. But the question I wanted to ask you is poetry worth criticizing? I'm saying that because on one hand, the thing that struck me when I came to poetry is how few people read poetry. And even that, I find that in the poetry world, that's quite a controversial idea that very few people read poetry. It doesn't seem to be very important in people's lives anymore, or at least very few people I meet does it seem important in. So I suppose you could say, look, it's just great that it still exists. Let's just rejoice in it. Let's just say how good it is that all these people are writing poetry now. Is poetry worth criticizing?
Well, that is the central question. I mean, really to begin any discussion of criticism about. But let me start by saying more people read poetry than we take account of. When people say that people don't read poetry, what they're mostly saying is that not a great many educated people read new poetry, contemporary poetry, very much. But the fact is that most people, and I don't mean simply most educated people, most people have poems which occupy important places in their life. And most people in the course of their education encounter poems, and those poems have a profound effect on their imagination and their sense of themselves. And so the fact is that, let's say that poetry plays an important role in people from the ages of 12 to 20, that in itself would make poetry an extraordinarily important art because it helps shape the adult independent identities of people. Now, I actually know a lot of statistics about this, and I'll say something that's true in the United States, which people didn't believe, but the fact is it's statistically demonstrable through the National Endowment for the Arts surveys, which are the biggest arts surveys in the world and have been done consistently for 4 decades now. The headline is this: poetry is the fastest growing art in the United States. I would reckon that it's probably the same in the UK if they tested it. Poetry is growing, especially among the young. The number of people between 18 and 35 who have begun reading poetry has doubled in the last 10 years. And this is at a time when virtually every other art in the United States has declined. This is sort of what I predicted in Can Poetry Matter, and which I discussed I don't know how you put it, a theoretical background in Disappearing Ink. And you can say that in a very simple sense, and people will hate this narrative, but I think it's true. In the course of the 20th century, in the course of modernism, and I say this as someone who believes that modernism was probably the greatest moment of American poetry, but you can have fantastic cultural moments that have undesired aftermaths. And what happened in American culture was that the modernist movement created an approach to poetry, a way of teaching poetry, and a way of writing about poetry that was counterproductive to increasing an audience or even keeping an audience. So in the modernism was over by about World War II. I mean, there was a couple of people still alive, like Pound or Eliot, but they were at the ends of their careers. And so, let's say by 1960, even, the giants had all died. And so you were in a situation where you had an academic institutionalization of poetry. So the poetry that was praised, the ways we talked about poetry were almost deliberately developed to exclude people. Because academic discourse, and this is, I'm not telling anybody anything they don't know, is as much about exclusion as it is inclusion. It's saying, this is my specialty, you keep out of it, I know it better than you. And so you put landmines everywhere. And so you had about a 50-year period, and I would say from about 1950 to about 2000, in which the public, not entirely, but was partially excluded from poetry. And it was funny for me because I'm a working class guy. I was the first person in my family to go to college. I was raised among people who, for the most part, did not speak English as their native language. And yet the people I was raised among, including my Mexican grandfather who had been a cowboy in his youth, all loved poetry. They all knew poems by heart. They recited poems. My mother would be doing housework and suddenly she would turn around and say, it was many and many a year ago in a kingdom by the sea that a maiden there lived whom you may know by the name of Annabel Lee. And that maiden, she lived with no other thought than to love and be loved by me. So I was at Harvard and I was being told that ordinary people did not like poetry, that the poetry of the future belonged to intellectuals because they were the only ones smart enough to really understand it. Now, if that isn't a self-serving lie, I don't know what is. And that rhyme and meter were forever dead because they were ancient European techniques, and the modern American poetry was going to go ever forward in terms of the late modernist aesthetic. And I realized this was a bankrupt theory. It was a self-serving academic theory. Now, I say that while also acknowledging that these were very smart, well-meaning people, but they didn't understand how completely locked they had become inside their professions. So that's my background to answering your question, which I'll answer very briefly. Poetry is one of the central human, spiritual, and cultural enterprises. Poetry goes back to a time before history, before writing, in which human beings were trying to articulate what it meant to be mortal in this magnificent, virtually infinite world. There's been a conversation that we call poetry, that in the West, it goes back, to the Greeks, to the Chinese, goes back to even further, which is a universal form of human discourse to use language raised to the level of song. If we lose this capability, we lose much of what it means to be human. So yes, it matters.
Yes, yes, indeed. But is it, so why but what about this idea? Because what you hear is that, oh, well, you don't need to criticize bad books, good books will just survive. You should just rejoice in it. What is the value of poetry criticism? In your criticism, you've said, quite striking things. For instance, you said that most contemporary poetry is simple and formulaic, even cozy. That was one of the things you said in studying with Miss Bishop, which are, again, has got all these markers in it. Why criticize it, and what about it? How come what contemporary poetry you think has tending to become simple and formulaic and even cozy?
Well, I think of poetry as a conversation. It is a special type of language. It is this language that is meant to be heard differently from ordinary language. It is meant to be read differently. So if you think of this, it's a special category of language. Now, if it's a conversation, the most natural thing to do is to have a conversation about it. If you and I went to the movies and we watched a movie, what would we do probably on the coming out of the theater? And let's say we went to dinner afterwards, we would talk about the movie. We would talk about this movie in relationship to other movies we'd seen. We'd talk about this movie in relationship to our perception of life. Well, this is a movie about Italy, but that's not the Italy that I experienced. Or wasn't it interesting how they got to this? Conversation is, once again, a natural human form of communication. And it's very simple, which is that by conversing with you, I say, well, gee, I see things this way. You tell me how you see them. And we learn from each other. We learn to recognize ourselves, and we also learn to understand the outer world. So it's the most natural human activity. And so we have criticism because if we have poetry, it's natural to converse about it. The real question is, has the conversation that we have about poetry become feeble, become dishonest, become self-serving, become pointless? And unfortunately, I think, I will buy a book and say, oh God, this is a book about a poet I love, and I can't read it. And it took me years to understand, why I can't read it? It's because it wasn't designed to be read. It was designed to give the person tenure. It was designed to impress an academic committee. It was designed to demonstrate the author's complete command of all the artistic and intellectual jargon, his or her understanding of critical theory. It was not ever designed to be an honest conversation between writer and reader. Now, please, I'm happy when people get tenure. I'm happy to see people employed and this, that, and the other, but don't ask me to read a book that's not meant to be read. It's a pointless exercise. And one knows this because every now and then you'll pick up a critic and you begin to read it and the lights go on inside your brain. Sometimes it's a serious critic. Sometimes it's a more populist critic, and it doesn't matter because you and I can have a jokey conversation, we can have a sincere conversation, we can have an earnest conversation, we could even, God help us, have a learned conversation. All of those conversations are legitimate, but they have to also be sincere, authentic, engaged, intelligent. And I
So
don't
why?
feel that you would say those things about most contemporary criticism, at least in the United States. Perhaps things are better in the UK.
Yeah, I'm not sure because why do you think that? Because that is a little bit of my one of the things I've been noticing is when I read poetry reviews, they seem more and more like a promotional copy um, rather than critics. Like I was reading a while ago Randall Jarrell, who's a critic that reminds you remind me of him. For me, you're in that kind of. I'd put your book next to Randall Jarrell's criticism, and he's incredibly tough. Reading him on what is Stevens. I'm a great lover of Stevens, but he's very, very tough on Stevens. He doesn't, he obviously really values him. But I don't read criticism like that very much anymore. I don't read criticism that's very rigorous about language and about the form. In fact, I see form kind of slightly sneered at as craft. Like going to a little craft show, and some people like doing little craft worky things, and isn't that sweet? But it's not very serious. I wonder what those trends have been that have weakened the conversation about poetry.
Well, in the United States, now, once again, the cultural situation of the US is different from the UK. And I know a lot about the UK, but I don't pretend to talk about it in any authority. Although it's funny, when Can Poetry Matter, the essay Can Poetry Matter was published, it became an international controversy. And it was translated into a lot of language. It was republished around the world. And when it was republished in the UK in a special issue of Poetry Review, with a bunch of people commenting on it, the most common comment was, well, that goes on in America, but things are just fine in the UK, which made me suspicious that maybe things weren't as fine as people were saying in the UK. But in the United States, you have to understand that between the end of World War II and now, to say the year, let's say 2000, that half century, poets went from working in Bohemia to teaching creative writing in universities. And if you go back earlier, poets worked as journalists. I mean, here's the great American modernist poets. T.S. Eliot was a banker and then a publisher. Wallace Stevens was an insurance lawyer. William Carlos Williams was a doctor. Robert Frost was a farmer, and then became a kind of still a farmer, but he would take very short gigs at colleges where he refused to teach. Interesting stories. He'd be a poet in residence. Marion Moore was a librarian, an editor, briefly I think an elementary teacher, but mostly librarian and editor. Robinson Jeffers was just a bohemian. E.E. Cummings was a bohemian. Edna St. Vincent Millay was a sort of a bohemian, and they supported themselves on writing and this. Who am I forgetting? And you look at this. None of them are academics. If you look at the current ones now, they're all teaching creative writing. And so what happened is that poetry went from an art to a profession. And this is undeniably a sociological fact. And so once you have people operating not as, bohemians, where your very mode of being is to épouter la bourgeoisie, to outrage the middle classes, to largely, and this is, let's call a spade. Most of these people are now state employees in large state colleges, in universities, community colleges, or in elite private colleges. And it changed the nature, I think, of the art. It especially changed the nature of criticism, because, I don't want to give you a bad review because you might be on my next prize committee. And, and I have been on prize committees, and this is the gospel truth. where people have contacted me with open bribes to get
Really?
an award, where they'll, and that's, now I don't know, the British are probably more honest than the Americans, but it's not, it wasn't like they were saying, hey, Dana, I'm going to do this, it's just like, this is how it's done. I've had a fellow judge turn to me and says, we should give it to Joe because Joe never forgets a favor, and this was not a compelling argument in my case to Joe's books, and so, I stopped going on these committees after a while because it's like, if you want to eat sausage, don't go to the sausage factory, and I was, and so it's, let me put it, it's genteel corruption at every level. I was offered a position at the New Yorker to review books of poetry. They wanted to do short reviews. And so I asked them 3 questions. Can I choose my own books? They said, no. The editors will choose the books. And you can be part of that discussion. I said, okay, well, if we choose a book, can I give a book that we've chosen a bad review? And they said, oh, no, because poetry, and this is the lie you hear again and again, poetry gets so little publicity, it's important to make it positive. And so to their astonishment, I turned down, it was the second time I turned down a job at the New Yorker, because I said, I have not worked as hard as I have to take a job like that. It's a dishonest position. And they were sort of surprised because, they understood quite rightly it was at the New Yorker. I mean, I should say this is 30 years ago. And so it's at every level, which is that, we're all in this together. Let's help each other. I'll do you a favor. You do me a favor. There's the big boys, and then there's the up and comers, and then there's the small poets. And so you see the situation where you have poets of enormous merit who are completely ignored because they're not part of the power structure. And so it is a bad situation, but it is quite explicable if you look at the sociology of poetry. How do American poets make their living? And that's what I talked about in the title essay of Can Poetry Matter? And that's why it was controversial. When it was published in Atlantic Monthly, it generated more mail than any article in the history of this famous magazine. And the mail was interesting because usually when people write, they write to talk about what they don't like about a piece. You always get angry letters. You never get friendly letters. 80% of the people wrote approvingly, and everybody who didn't like the piece identified themselves as a creative writing teacher or a member of a creative writing seminar. And the interesting thing is that the 80% of the people that liked it all said a variation more or less of the same thing. They were a farmer. They were a diplomat. They were a soldier. They were a doctor. They were a housewife. They were one case a cowboy, and they all loved poetry, and they didn't understand what had happened in poetry. Why did they feel cut off from their own culture?
I mean, that for me is sort of like the crux of things, because one of the things that I was really struck by in your criticism is you argue that a literary culture is based on trust. Trust between the critic and the reader. And you were saying, I can't remember which of the essays it was in, that you were saying that you feel that trust has been broken.
I mean, not by everybody, but customarily by the reviewing enterprise in the United States. I mean, as a critic, you should say, well, Dana Gioia might be right, he might be wrong. They don't know if I'm, but they should assume that I'm being candid, that I'm giving you my honest opinion, and I've taken the trouble to actually look at the text. Now, I might give you my honest opinion about a book I've never read, and one sees that. I realized many years into my reviewing life that many of my fellow reviewers did not actually finish the book. They just looked at the book and reviewed it. And that shocked me because I mean, if I was reviewing a book, I read it to pieces. I covered it with annotations. Why? Because I was so naive to believe that the critic's task was important for the health of the culture.
Mm. Can you say more about why the critic? Because I agree with that. Why is the critic's task? Is it to do with an honest conversation and not?
It is. It's the same thing. I mean, no matter how smart you or I or anybody watching is today, that we're never smart enough to figure out the world by ourselves. We learn by reading. We learn by talking to people. We learn by listening to people. And if we, there are conversations I had 50 years ago that changed my life. There are conversations I had 50 years ago that suddenly will pop into my mind and help clarify a moment in my life. If you don't have those kind of conversations about an art form, then I think people become locked in their own sensibility and they become less engaged. I mean, in a very simple sense, a culture talks about what it considers important.
Yes.
A culture demands honesty about those things that it considers almost beyond price. And so, now, once again, I don't know if I'm telling the truth. I mean, no matter how hard I try, I just wrote a long essay on Baudelaire. I spent 6 months writing and shaping this thing, but I may have gotten things wrong. So I don't know if I'm telling the truth or not, but I do know if I'm lying. If I'm suppressing something, if I'm changing something, I know that. And so I believe in life, and certainly as a writer, the most important thing, or not maybe the most important, one of the important things is not to lie, not to allow yourself to lie. And it's not usually the giant lies, although maybe sometimes it is, but it's all those 10 little compromises that takes a clear statement and turns it into a fuzzy and evasive statement. But anyway, if you consider poetry important as a human art, then the criticism of poetry becomes almost equally important because it is the conversation, it is the way we perceive, we clarify, we discuss, we understand this art in our minds and in our lives.
Yes, indeed, and that's very well said. I mean, the other thing that really, well, there's so many things that you've said in your essays that really struck me, but one of the things I really loved was, because it challenged very much with my own feelings. I felt that poetry didn't need any more writers, it needed more readers. It needs better readers. In the UK, some people believe that there are more people writing poetry than reading it. And I've met poets who only seem to read their mates, really, only seem to read their friends and the people who would agree with them ideologically.
Well, let me say something. That's okay. I mean, it's not a bad cultural model to think that poetry as a mode of perceiving our lives, as a mode of articulating our lives, is an enterprise which involves everyone. The most natural thing in the world may be to write a poem. Now, the key thing is to understand it's different to write a poem just for yourself, or to write a poem for yourself and your mates, your friends, as we would say in the US. And those are worthy human occupations, and they intensify your awareness of yourself and the awareness of language. But the critic has to make a distinction between those levels of poetry and the people who are writing, for strangers, for a broader audience, who are in a sense skilled enough to, create language which people who have never met them can understand. And so I don't think it at all bad that people write poetry, that people read their friends' poetry. That seems to be, once again, part of the whole conversation about poetry. The problem is then when we cannot distinguish between that kind of poetry and what I would think of as poetry as a more capacious and serious intellectual artistic, spiritual enterprise.
Mm.
So, hooray for all the amateur poets. Hooray, hooray for all the semi-amateurs. But if you want to go in the big time, be tough enough to take a bad review. Be tough enough to have your work criticized honestly. Because we have kind of a wimpy culture, and especially it's because, well, I can't say what I really, people tell us all the time, I can't really say what I think about this book because, Joe's a friend of mine, Wendy's a friend of mine. And, it's crippling. You might as well not write criticism. You might as well not publish a review if it's just, this is a term that a friend of mine used to use in business, if it's all happy horse shit.
I mean, the other talk about the amateur poets and so on, you really value the amateur reader, don't you? I really liked that. You talk about a kind of reader that you're writing for, who is an engaged, sort of serious in the right sense, and you can be serious in the wrong sense, of course, but serious in the right sense reader, not an academic, but just someone who loves the stuff. You talk about that reader, don't you?
The purpose of an art is not to exclude people. I mean, if we think art has human value, it should have some relevance to humanity. Now, let me, I don't want to be laborious, although God knows I've probably been insufferably laborious so far. When I was in graduate school, I was the scholarship student. I loved graduate school. I loved criticism. I loved all this stuff. And what I really had begun to believe is, this is, I think, the great academic heresy, that what poetry would be to take, let's say, a poem by John Donne and discover the inevitable and correct reading of that poem, which basically showed all the mistakes anybody else would be making to read it in any other way. And as a poet, I began to think of, well, my poem has to be read in this way. This has to mean this has to mean that. And I realized eventually that was a kind of self-serving deception. And what I've learned in a poet is this. Now, it surprised me, but the older I get, the more I recognize the truth of it. I will write a poem which somebody will read, and I'm talking about an intelligent person who's not a literary critic, and they will interpret it entirely differently from how I meant it to be interpreted, and yet they are right. Now, what do I mean by that? What I mean is that the poet creates a poem. I need three hands to do this better, The poet creates a poem to reach readers. But here's the interesting thing. This reader brings his or her entire life into the reading of the poem, just as I, as a writer, brought my entire life in this. But for a poem to be any good, it has to, and we recognize this, it has to be, independent of my life. It might be like a child that you've sent into the world to lead his or her independent life. And the reader rightly meets this independent being and finds what is useful for their own lives. I think I had some errors of agreement in that sentence, but you understand it. And suddenly that made me understand more than ever what meant a good poem and what the human purposes of poetry were. Now, what is a good poem? I think a good poem is a poem which creates an enchantment, which is to say, the reader reads it and they, Emily Dickinson said the top of their head comes off, but it means suddenly they get this sort of surge of curiosity, of interest, of emotion. They feel a momentary spell of heightened awareness, heightened emotional vulnerability, heightened imaginative sensitivity. Then they have an encounter with that poem. It's an encounter that's different than the ordinary business of their day. So as a poet, I'm trying to create that encounter. That's the first thing. And the second thing, I'm trying to create a work which allows them to enter in. And the metaphor I use is I try to create a room in which something important is happening, will happen, has happened. And I have the room pretty well furnished, so that they understand exactly, it's like working, walking, into the crime scene of a British mystery, where all of the clues are there. But this is the essential thing. I leave out some of the most important things, which the reader then has to produce from their own past, their own imagination, their own memories. And so that the act of reading becomes a collaboration between my imagination and their imagination, my life and their life. And I believe that is what great writers do. They allow the reader to finish the poem. Now, having said that, some readers finish it brilliantly, some finish it terribly. But who am I, as the author who has received the great kindness and generosity of having a stranger read my poem, to deny them the ability to find meaning that for their own lives? And that was the revelation for me. And it sounds terrible to say this, but it's true. My job as a poet is to create objects of enchantment that prove useful to people's lives, and useful in the most important spiritual, emotional, personal circumstances. So you get back to what W.H. Auden said, that poetry is a game and poetry is a priestly task. If you don't do the game, if you don't do the enchantment, the musicality, the song making well, the deeper encounter cannot happen. And it took me many years to realize that. I don't know how well I do it, but at least I think I finally understand what it is a poet should be doing. And I have thousands of readers. I don't know how they came to my work, and they make thousands of different demands on the work. And I could never predict what they need. Although intuitively, I can perhaps create the circumstances from my own life, my own imagination, which allow them to have a transaction they would not find in their ordinary reading.
I mean, I'm really struck by what you're there saying, because your reading of poetry seems to me to be deeply humane. It's to do with a meeting of consciousness with consciousness. The particularities of your consciousness somehow reaching through time and space and touching the particularities of someone else's consciousness. Well, I'm wondering now. Go on.
Wait, just say one sentence. A poet needs to be democratic. You cannot be. We are elitist in our craft, but we must be democratic and inclusive in the purposes of our art. Sorry to interrupt you.
And so what? I mean, that seems to me, sort of crucial for poetry, that you're trying to find a way in which the intimate, personal becomes somehow universal, or at least touches something in the intimate, personal in the other. What I'm starting to see a little bit more, and perhaps I'm wrong in this, and I don't know the poetry world that well, but there seems to be a new, I don't know whether it is new, perhaps it isn't actually thinking back, but a more of a sense of poetry should have you talk about use, but use in a different way, and a use to, I don't know, promote LGBT rights, or a feminist use, or some kind of ideological use or theoretical use. It should be doing something in that way. It should be, I don't know, improving the world in that way, which seems to me a different kind of idea of use than you're using.
Well, I am in this way. If I write a poem which can only be interpreted in a single way, I limit the kinds of encounters that people can have. And throughout history, people have they've wanted to make poetry into advertising. An advertisement And, and I worked in marketing earlier in my career. An advertisement is you take an image, you take words, you take an idea to penetrate people's consciousness to a single conclusion. Political propaganda is that way. Religious propaganda, is that way. And language can be used that way. Poetry can be written that way. But that kind of poetry doesn't interest me. What I'm interested in is the much more mysterious, unpredictable, and entirely human encounters where if I have 1,000 readers, those 1,000 readers are all at different stages of their lives. They're at different stages of their consciousness. They're going through different events. And can you make something, can you create an encounter which helps, you can't say all of them, but helps more of them rather than fewer of them clarify that what it means to be human, what it means to be mortal, what it means to live in time. Now, I'm also, I think, my poetry is metaphysical. I mean, I try to write both about the material, temporal, mortal world, but also a sense of what's that behind that, is an invisible world, an eternal, an invisible, world, and that in our lives at every moment, those two things coexist meaningfully, and that part of now you can define what this is. You can say, well, I'm Catholic, so it's an objective reality. You can say, well, I'm Jungian, so it's a interior psychological, psychic reality. It doesn't matter, because I think we all instinctively feel ourselves as independent beings, but also part of something vastly greater than ourselves, which we can barely imagine. That the metaphysical consciousness is not an intellectual thing, it's almost a human universal. Now, granted, in big cities, the material world of humanity becomes so beguiling that the other world becomes a little harder to reach. But I live in the country, I live in a way that, I see more animals than people, more trees than people. And I'm always in the presence that the world is moving on its own without human agency. And that I'm part of something that, I can barely comprehend, even if I have all these books on science and flowers and trees and everything else, and I try to learn the objective facts about the situation. So I think you can use poetry for narrow, didactic ways. There's, when Goethe was asked by, was it Eckermann to talk about poetry, Goethe says, well, there are three kinds of poetry. There's, there's narrative poetry, the epic poetry where you tell a story. There's dramatic poetry where people, become characters and talk to each other. There's lyric poetry. And then he paused and he goes, und ja, didaktische. Yeah, and then that's real poetry. And there's a fourth kind called didactic, where you can just put things in verse. And so I think there's didactic poetry, but I think it is the least of what Goethe called the Naturformen, the natural forms of poetry. I love that, Naturformen, this notion of that these are natural human forms of communication.
It's interesting. I've been reading James Merrill a lot recently. I've just sort of recently discovered James Merrill, and he was someone in an interview was saying, "Oh, your writing is becoming more political," and he said, "Well, enough to write a 14-line poem, yes," but he was saying that he just didn't feel that politics touched the psyche deeply enough. That he thought it only touched a part of you, and so you ended up with a sort of.
Well, yeah, I mean, here's another basic definition. There's different kinds of human discourse. I mean, it's clear for us, as poets, to say that scientific discourse is a language in and of itself. It's numbers, it's ratios, and they can describe reality using those numbers, those formulas, those elaborate, the elaborate calculus of the material world. And it's important. It's got value. There's also conceptual thought. That's what we're doing right now. We're talking through abstractions. We talk about poetry. Well, what's poetry? Poetry is an idea about an object that we've seen called a particular poem that moved us. And we talk about criticism, we talk about society, we talk about readers. Those are all abstractions. And we need this. This is conceptual thought. That's how society writes laws. That's how newspapers, describe events. All hail to conceptual thought. You and I would share that there's a different kind of knowledge, and we shouldn't even get into this because people will think we're crazy, which is mystical knowledge, which is where you pull yourself out, and by pulling yourself out of all the human discourses, you achieve a certain kind of thing. I have very little capacity as a mystic. You probably have much greater. Certainly as a Buddhist, and I as a Catholic understand that there are people with enormous capacity for this who achieve a kind of knowledge that's beyond articulation. But let's say you don't even believe in that. There is another kind of discourse, which I would call poetic, artistic. And what makes the poetic discourse unique is that conceptual discourse is intellectual, scientific discourse is intellectual. These are analytical discourses. Poetry does not ask us to separate our humanity. We listen to language. Tiger, tiger, burning bright in the forests of the night, what immortal hand or eye could frame thy fearful symmetry? Now, it has an analytical meaning, but that a poem speaks to us simultaneously as thinkers, feelers, our emotions, people with physical senses, people with imagination, with intuition, and most importantly, a physical body. Dum, 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 which is probably not too different than dum, 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 dum. We have, I forget the number, 21 separate rhythms inside of our body that we experience physically. And poetry talks to us in the fullness of our humanity and does not ask us to separate it. Conceptual thought does. And that's the trouble of trying to write a poem that's a conceptual poem, is you're really only speaking to a fraction of the human capacity of your audience. And that is also why, no matter what the people, the faculty of Harvard or Yale think, people that don't have a lot of intellectual understanding of poetry and the traditions of poetry can nonetheless experience a complicated poem deeply because they have a powerful human intelligence, a complete human intelligence. I mean, who always gets poems? Musicians. Now, musicians, some of my best friends are musicians. Musicians don't always tend to be the A students. They're often the most disruptive kids in class. I say that of some knowledge since I originally was a musician. I came to poetry out of music. These are the class clowns. These are the introvert, but they have trained capacity, imaginative, performative, and don't miss this, physical capacities that allow them to perceive this. Painters tend to be pretty good readers of poetry. Cowboys, people that spend a lot of time on the range by themselves are doing this. My great grandfather and my grandfather were vaqueros. They were Mexican cowboys on the range. They would get around and they would sing and they would recite poems. They would recite poems in Spanish. They would recite them in English, and it became very important parts of their imaginative and their interior lives. So let us not, as artists, begin by underestimating the spiritual, emotional, and imaginative capacity of other human beings. Let us, as artists, try to speak to what is best, strongest, and truest in other people.
Indeed. I want to start to move towards an end because there's so much I'd like to talk to you about, Dan, and I want to make sure we get a break and then go look at your poems because there's everything to say about those. But I do want to come to this religious sense. You're a very committed Catholic. I've committed my life to Buddhism, I was really struck by you talking about a loss of transcendent religious vision, and how that was that had spiritually diminished America. You also talked about the work of art as having this radiance. I thought it would be good to just say a little bit about the need for a transcendental religious vision. I'm now sort of rather almost preferring the word religion to spiritual, because spiritual can easily get so kind of flaky and kind of woozy and so on. It's not always that, I know, but can you say
So I'm a
something?
very spiritual person because I eat free range eggs at my Sunday brunch. You know, I mean, you hear these sorts of things. No, I think you've got to be, to say you're religious is slightly offensive
Yeah.
to most intellectuals. If I said I'm religious to my fellow poets, they'll either roll their eyes or they'll just make a snide comment, or they'll just sympathize me for my feeble intellect. But you know, um, we can live in two worlds. We can live in the city of man, or we can live in the city of God. And when you live in the city of God, you're also living in the city of man, but you're seeing beyond it. America today, I'm sure England is much better in every respect. America today is entirely materialistic. It's about money. It's about possessions. You know, it's about celebrity, which is a kind of cultural currency. It's about physical experience, physical luxuries. You know, and I find that hollow. I believe everybody should have a place to live. Everybody should have enough to eat. They should have clothes to wear. But we are in a culture. It's interesting, even the political arguments, they're not about values anymore, but it's about who gets more of what. And I think that that's a kind of bankruptcy. It's certainly a spiritual bankruptcy. And I think that in order to have any kind of spiritual authenticity, you have to, in a sense, break away from some of these things. Now, I'm not saying, you know, and I think the mistake is to reduce it all into that we're going to solve material problems through a different material political philosophy. I think we, at least some of the writers, the leaders, the exemplars in our society need to live by different values. If you look at the 10,000 most famous people in America, you'll find very few that are living by different values. I mean, we just had a celebrity president, you know, in our culture to great damage. But and I think of this especially in terms of how do you form your life? If you're a child, you're an adolescent trying to figure out how to lead your life, what choices to make in your life. And all of the examples that you're given are people, you know, for whom money, possessions, celebrity, you know, and even bad behavior, but let's not get into that, because are the models. Who do you choose from? You know, it's you know, I think it's important to have people who live, you know, by, you know, I'll say higher values, by less selfish values. Now, for me, I was raised in a big city. I spent years in New York, in Boston, and for a variety of personal reasons, I ended up in the country in Northern California. Although 25 years later, the suburbs begin to you know, sort of encroach on me. But suddenly I found myself as living a part of natural rhythms, but forces that I couldn't control, seeing virtually everyday wonders. I mean, things that have always been here, but I've been too sheltered and too busy to notice. A deer giving birth, you know, and these, you know, flowers coming, you know, these mysterious sounds that you discover. You see the rhythms of things, flocks of birds that are there for a week and then disappear, and you begin to understand why these things are. And so begin to appreciate something, which is that you're part of something larger than yourself. When we look at ourselves in relation to reality, there is only one possible emotion: humility. And I think to live with humility, with a notion of the limitations of our own consciousness, our own behavior, our own needs, is the beginning of wisdom. I don't believe that that kind of wisdom is encouraged in my society. And religion, for all of its complications and everything else, at least offers, something other than this. Now, I am a Catholic because I was raised a Catholic. I'm not a particularly devout Catholic, as Catholics understand devotion, but what it does give me is a way of judging my own life, my own values, my own behavior. And it's made me do things that I wouldn't do otherwise. It's made me love people, forgive people that I would not have loved or forgiven otherwise. It's made me take some of my material possessions and understand that I must give them away. I must not be owned by what I own. It's made me understand that the 20 acres of woods that I live on is something I do not own. I only manage for the future. These things are all religious things, and that it is my job, in a sense, to be humble before what I have been given and what I experience, to love, to forgive, and to distance myself from my own desires. Now, this kind of Catholicism, I think, is very close to Buddhism. And the other thing is to accept my suffering as part of what it means to be human. I lost my first son. It was a scarring, horrifying loss for my wife and I. But that's when I began to understand that I could take that pain and it would either make me feel less, or I could accept it and go where it wanted to guide me. And I think for me, that was a weird thing. It began to change me as a person. It made me into a kinder person. Why? Because I've been a successful person. I was a good student. I had good parents. I was raised poor. Don't get me wrong, very poor. But my parents were good people. My larger family were good people. So I was given the love, the self-esteem, which is what a child needs. And so I was lucky in life. Then I lost my first son, and I began to understand then that I could only, that allowed me to understand other people who were broken, other people who had gone to losses, and that we were all brothers. We were all brothers and sisters in this life, and that we had to share our fortune. This is not a political insight. This is a spiritual, a religious insight.
We've been talking about, can poetry matter, the value of poetry, the possibility of poetry to reach out and meet people in their fullness, really, you're saying, body, mind, heart, and soul. We've been talking about how the conversation about poetry at least seems to have thinned and sometimes become even, I would say, dishonest. What can we do what can be done to bring poetry, show people the value of poetry more, have people meet each other at this level that we're calling, I don't know, religious or spiritual, or just simply more deeply human? How can poetry help in that project? How can it bring us, how can we make more of it? What can we do, I suppose I want to finish with.
Let me say the good news. There are tens of thousands, perhaps more than tens of thousands of intelligent, readers of poetry, lovers of poetry. Some of them write poetry, some of them are readers, a few of them review. So we have all of the cultural capacity that we need to change the problem. But these people, these our fellow readers, our fellow lovers of poetry, our fellow poets need to engage the art with more candor uh, and more energy. They could overnight change the culture. And one occasionally sees this where somebody will have been for 40 years behaving the way that POBIZ, as they call it in America, POBIZ, the business of poetry, wants them to behave. They've been following all of the rules of professional behavior. Then suddenly they realize at the end of their life, they've gotten nothing from it except, perpetuating a system they don't like. And it's a little hard at that point to make the change, although I've seen some people do it, quite dramatically. But I think, and I speak to people in their 20s and 30s who love poetry. You are the future of the art. You're the future of criticism. You're the future of readership. You see things with the wisdom of your own experience, with the sharpness of the perspective of your generation. Don't make the mistakes that your elders have. This human art is too important to turn into materialistic tokens of professional advancement. The materialism that disturbs me so much in American culture is found in POBIZ, where people are trading, favors for their own financial professional advancement. To the younger people, you're not going to get a job. You're not going to get rich from this. You're not going to get famous for this. What you are given is something actually that's more precious if you denominate it in a different currency, which is that you will be given joy, wisdom, consolation, and kind of intellectual expansion from this. You will be given the very things by which you will be able to lead a fuller, better, happier, wiser life. What greater salary can anything offer you? But you have to understand that it's not denominated in dollars and cents or pounds and pence. And so, and that's what I mean is that we need to have a religious or a spiritual orientation on this, because the materialistic culture is so pervasive, nowadays. We must awaken ourselves to the joys of our own existence, which are not denominated by money.
That's a great place to finish. Thanks very much, Dana Gioia. Really, really good to talk to you.